Hello, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I have the distinct pleasure of having again one of the people that you have to follow if you want to understand money, Professor Steve Hanke. He's a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, one of the leading experts in terms of monetary policy, advisor to governments. I mean, the CV is absolutely phenomenal, and popular demand. We had a tremendous discussion a few months ago about money growth, inflation, and the outlook for the U.S. economy. And it is for me an absolute pleasure to welcome you back to continue with that discussion. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Daniel. Good to be with you. And a happy new year to you and your guests.
Happy New Year as well. Absolutely. So let's start with what monetary aggregates are showing and the outlook of inflation. We discussed a few months ago how it was very obvious that with the decline of monetary aggregates, there was going to be a significant reduction of inflation. This is what we have seen so far. And what I'd like to know is what is the outlook that you expect? How do you see the situation in terms of inflation, particularly in the United States? And we can go on if you want about other economies if you're interested.
Okay, Daniel. Let me first suggest that I give a little background on where I'm coming from and why these monetary aggregates are important to be looking at. Remember, in simple terms, money is the fuel of the economy. So you have to pay attention to the monetary aggregates and measures in the United States. The broadest measure officially of the money supply is what they call M2. So you have to be watching these things and trying to understand what makes them change, what makes them go up and go down. So let's start kind of from the beginning of the current, shall we say, cyclical episode in the monetary aggregates in the United States. Remember, when COVID came, the monetary aggregate M2, it started increasing very rapidly, and at one point in 2021, it peaked out, growing at a 27% year-over-year rate. Now, that's a very high rate of growth. We've never experienced that kind of rate of growth in the money supply since the Fed, the central bank, was established in 1913. So the first thing after the pandemic hit in February 2020, the money supply goes shooting up. And when I say 27% was their all-time record high year over year, to put it into context, for the Fed to hit its inflation target using the quantity theory of money, we would need the growth rate in that M2 money supply to be growing at around 6% per year. So it was growing over 3 times faster, almost 4 times faster than it should have been growing. So what happened? We had inflation. Again, the quantity theory of money, too much money chasing too few goods, you're going to end up with inflation. And I work on this with John Greenwood, who's actually the former chief economist, retired at Invesco, and a fellow at the Johns Hopkins University at my Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise. So Greenwood and I work on this using the quantity theory of money. They would call us monetarists in the jargon. And we predicted after this huge increase in the money supply, what was going to happen. We predicted that inflation would reach maybe as high as 9%. Well, it reached in June of 2022, it reached 9.1%. So it was very accurate, our prediction based on the quantity theory of money. And when I say the quantity theory of money, I mean the equation of exchange. MV, money times velocity, equals PY, the price level times the real rate of growth in the economy. So that was the upside of the cycle. And then all of a sudden, the Fed put on the brakes and put things in reverse, and the money supply starts going down and decreasing. And it's been falling rapidly since March of 2022. And we've lost around 4.5% of our money supply since March of 2022. So then Greenwood and I, based again on the equation of exchange quantity theory, predicted that inflation would end this last year, I should say, 2023, between 2 and 5%. Well, it ended at 3.4%. So we hit it. We were right on again. And where's the money supply right now? Well, the money supply number today, by the way, we're talking in January 24th, 2024. Yesterday, the 23rd, the money supply number came out, and it's contracting year over year at a minus 2.3% rate, but it actually increased a little bit, slightly from November to December. So the rate of decline is slowed down. And if you look at the 6-month or 3-month rate of growth in the money supply on an annualized basis, the 6-month is actually growing at, it's about 0.1. But the 3-month is actually increasing by 2.4%. So you say, well, what's happened? Because the Fed is still engaged in quantitative tightening. They're shrinking the assets that they have on their balance sheet. That would normally lead directly to a reduction in the money supply. And they haven't changed the federal funds rate, so that's status quo kind of thing. But why hasn't the money supply continued to sharply decline in the last 2 months? And that's because the interest rates are up and money's pouring into the money market funds. And when that happens, to make a long story short, and you look at what changes occur on the asset side of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, the kind of credit, what we call credit counterparts analysis, to see what's happening on the liability side, you find the following thing, and that is that the repos, the loans that are being made to the Fed have decreased dramatically. That means the reserves are decreasing dramatically. And what's going on is that the money markets, instead of ending up repoing into the Federal Reserve, which would increase the reserves on the books of the Fed, they've been buying treasuries. And when they buy treasuries, they have to buy them from the non-bank public. And when they buy them from the non-bank public, that increases the deposits at the commercial banks by the non-bank public, and deposits in commercial banks are part of M2. They're part of the money supply. So what you have quantitative tightening squeezing. That's a negative effect on M2, but this fact that now with higher interest rates and treasuries being attractive, the money market funds are buying treasuries. They are buying them from the non-bank public, increasing the deposits of the non-bank public in the banking system. That increases. So you've had kind of, in effect, kind of a mitigation of the negative effects of quantitative tightening in the last 2 months. So it hasn't, in short, M2 hasn't been falling as rapidly as it was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But where does that leave us? Well, this won't go on forever. The quantitative tightening will I think continue, and as the short-term interest rates eventually start coming down, the treasuries won't look as attractive to the money markets funds, and money won't be pouring into the money market funds. They won't be buying as many treasuries. The deposits in by the non-bank public won't be going up, and that mitigation effect on M2 won't be occurring. So I think we will continue to eventually see the pace picking up again,
yeah,
due to quantitative tightening of the money supply coming down.
Yeah.
Now, where does this leave us? This contraction in the money supply that we've witnessed since March of 2020 means that we're going to have an inflation, inflation coming down.
Hmm.
And now Greenwood and I predict by the end of 2024 that inflation will probably be 2% or less in the United States. That's below, a little, maybe even below the inflation target of the Fed. That's inflation. And sometime, probably late in 2024, we'll see the baked in the cake recession, because we've had all this contraction in the money supply, and with long lags, that works its way into the economy in a negative way. And to give you some perspective on this, Daniel, there have only been 4 times in the United States history where the money supply has contracted. I should say the history of the Fed since 1913. It's a little over 110 years. We've only had 4 times where you had money contraction. And the last time we had a money contraction like we're having now was 1929, 1933. And that was followed by a recession. All the other episodes, 22 and 23, we had a decline, and we then had, excuse me, we 1948, 49, 1948, 49, we had a contraction, then we had a recession. 37, 38, we had a contraction in the money supply, and that was followed by a recession. 1929, 1933, we of course know what happened then. We didn't have a recession. We had a Great Depression. 2021, we had a contraction that was followed by a recession. So that's the picture of where a monetarist looking at the money supply sees the picture. And the picture is one of this great contraction in the money supply. The contraction slowed temporarily. I think it'll probably continue, but that is going to lead to continued downward pressure on prices and ultimately a recession.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting part of this is that most economists now, they don't use the quantity theory of money. They don't even teach the quantity theory of money at university anymore. And they've not been able to predict, using the models they use, the zigs and zags in inflation. They were never able to predict, as Greenwood and I did, the increase in inflation. They haven't been able to predict the decrease in deflation. And I think they're completely missing the recession picture. They're advertising what they call a soft landing. Everything's going to smoothly reach normal again. So why have they rejected the classic relationship between changes in the money supply and changes in inflation? And by the way, if you go back historically and look at, for example, the work of the great Gottfried von Habler, late Gottfried von Habler, and a mentor of mine, a professor at Harvard, great economist. He wrote a book on stagflation,
yeah,
a classic book, and he said in that book that he knew of no cases where there were sustained increases in inflation over 4%, lasting for more than 2 years, that weren't preceded by sustained increases in the money supply. And of course, we know what Milton Friedman says. He says, there's basically a one-to-one relationship between changes in the money supply and changes in the price level. I just did a study late last year of 147 countries in which I looked at the annual changes in the money supply and annual changes in the consumer price index, and the correlation coefficient was 0.96. It was almost 1. It was almost exactly what Friedman says. You change the money supply and you just almost get a one-to-one relationship between that change and whatever is going on with the price level. So the question is, well, why do they reject this? And I think there are 3 reasons. I think one is that the models that are being used now are what's called post-Keynesian macroeconomic models. In the jargon of the trade, they're called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, DSGE, DSGE. So even with that name, that leaves you kind of suspect. General stochastic general equilibrium models. I prefer the quantity theory of money. That's easier to understand. So that's one thing. Now, those models don't include an aggregate metric for money.
Yeah.
Like M2. M2 is not in there. M3 is not in there. M4 is not. There's no M in those models. So that's one reason. The second reason that they reject the idea of the quantity theory of money and that there's a link between changes in the money supply and inflation is that all central banks want a narrative being spun out once inflation hits because people don't like inflation.
Yeah.
So the central banks don't want to be blamed for inflation. So they say there are lots of non-monetary factors that cause inflation, not changes in the money supply. So that's the second reason. They tend to say, there's a quote by a distinguished journalist actually at the Wall Street Journal, John Stenerud. He writes a column in the Heard on the Street column, and he said about a week ago, inflation has proven to be mostly driven by commodity prices and supply chain disruptions. Now that's a non-monetary thing. It's just wrong, but that's the narrative. That's a summary of the narrative coming out of the central banks. The last factor is politics, and that is if you look at the Federal Reserve System has 785 economists. None of them predicted the increase in inflation.
Yeah.
And the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is 48.5 to 1. So you have almost all the professional economists are Democrats, not Republicans. Now you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a lot of difference because enemy number one of the Democrats is still Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman is like the dean of the quantity theory of money. So I think a political factor is worked in there, as well as the post-Keynesian models they use, as well as a normal reaction to blame inflation on something besides money once inflation rears its ugly head. So I think that is pretty much a summary on the recession that I anticipate coming, and the continued drop in the consumer price index, all coming back to something that happened a long time ago. Remember, once you get a change in the money supply, Daniel, it takes time to emit that surge or change through the system. So long and variable lags, but ultimately you get something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm actually recovering the data from your study, which show the correlation coefficient between money growth and inflation, staggering. And you can see in the period from 1960 to 1990, in 110 countries, that the correlation is, as you said, 95%. No? But what I find very interesting is the way is that what you also debunk is the narrative that the idea of money supply growth and inflation was ended in 2008, 2009. And here you give the correlation between 1990 and 2021 in 147 countries. And the relationship, the correlation, is 0.944, 94%, 95%.
Yeah.
Absolutely unquestionable. And the thing that I find interesting about what you just said, this narrative. No,
yeah, what's interesting about it. What I did, the first period that you gave, 1960 to 1991, that was actually published by the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank.
Yes.
That study. And what all I did, I used exactly their methodology that they used at the Minneapolis Fed. Warren Weber was a distinguished economist. He was one of the co-authors of that study. And all I did is use updated data from 1990 to 2021.
Yeah.
So I just updated with more countries, and the data come from the IMF, by the way.
Yeah.
So what was fascinating to me is that I almost got exactly the same correlation coefficients they did.
Absolutely. And more importantly, completely destroying the narrative that the relationship between money growth and inflation stopped existing in 2008 because of all of the different things that neo-Keynesians say. And this narrative, obviously, of supply chain disruptions generating inflation and commodities generating inflation. If one looks at the reality of the price action in freight rates, in commodities between 2022 and 2023, which was an inverted V shape that ended well below the levels prior to the Ukraine invasion. When you look at those, inflation would have not risen because of those factors. It would have actually gone to a massively lower level. And obviously, an exogenous factor doesn't make prices rise in tandem, all of them at the same time. One exogenous factor doesn't lead all other prices and generate inflation in all other prices, unless there is more money going to relatively scarce assets. But what I find interesting is also the lag effect, because the new narrative is, and I was reading the other day, Krugman was tweeting or Xing, I don't know how you say that anymore, saying that there had been a victory over inflation without any significant impact on the economy. Well, if you look at the growth of the US economy, excluding the accumulation of debt, it's the worst year since 1930. And the evidence in the manufacturing sector, in the small and medium enterprises, in real wage growth, all of that is showing that the lag effect is certainly affecting those that are more vulnerable to the increase in rates and the reduction in money supply. And the point that he was looking at was what the stock market was doing. But that goes back to your point, is that you showed that net liquidity, which is the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve plus the reverse repo injections of liquidity, net liquidity soared into the end of 2023, reducing the negative impact on money supply growth. But that goes in cycles. And in 2023, there were 3 cycles of reverse repo injection. The first one in the first half, that was also reducing the pace of money growth. The opposite in the second half, which ended in the fourth quarter with a significant significant rise, which also led to the bullish performance of markets. But the interesting thing is that that is reversing yet again, coming to your point. So the lag effect of both rate hikes and the money supply growth in the overall economy has been, on the one hand, disguised on GDP by a very significant increase in government spending and debt. But what is the lag effect usually that we have to look at of this, where we start to really see a significant reduction in the economic aggregates that support GDP?
Okay, Daniel, that is very helpful what you had to say. Let me just mention one thing about Professor Krugman. Professor Krugman, you notice if you read his column, he'll never mention the word money.
Never.
Or money supply. Never. You read it and it's like magic. All of a sudden, we've succeeded. Well, why has inflation come down? Well, it's come down because of this money supply contraction. So that's the first just remark more than anything else. Most of these authors who are anti-monetarist will never mention the word money at all, and they'll have all kinds of non-monetary rationales and reasons for why things are happening. But what's going on, this lag effect that the second point, the lag effect is the crucial thing, because they look at, they're data dependent. They look at contemporary data every day, and they look at interest rates, for example, or the stock market or whatever it happens to be. But they don't realize that all those changes, like changes in inflation and changes in the real economic activity, that's because something happened a year and a half ago with the money supply.
Exactly.
But they're not looking at that. And the reason that even people who look at the money supply get themselves tangled up and make mistakes, they don't appreciate these lags. They tend to look at the contemporaneous number for the money supply and say, oh, that's what's going on. They don't realize that they should be looking at what was going on at the money supply 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, or a year ago. So the lag thing is what confuses most people, even if they're inclined to think money is important. They don't appreciate what these lags are at all.
Absolutely.
And so the lags turn out to be a key factor. And now you ask a question. You said, well, given the lags, what do I think about real economic activity? I've told you that Greenwood and I have been very accurate on forecasting and anticipating inflation.
Yeah.
That's unambiguous. I think we're the best in the world on that. No one's come close.
Undeniable.
Now, the real economic activity, at first we thought the recession would happen in 2023. Well, it didn't. And we eventually ended up changing our mind and pushing it off into the future. And that's this long and variable lag. At first, we thought when the money supply started declining very rapidly, that would kick in and bite the economy quickly. So instead of having a 6-month to 18-month lag between changes in the money supply and real economic activity, we were kind of on the 6-month side, kind of short, okay? But we turned out to be wrong in our timing. Not the fact that we're going to have a recession, but on our timing. We said it was going to occur more rapidly than it actually is going to occur. Now, the reason for that is that this huge increase in the money supply created a tremendous amount of excess money relative to people's income or current GDP. And that huge amount of excess was draining off much more slowly than Greenwood and I thought. And it took almost until it's not right now about drained off.
Yeah. Agreed.
So now these negative numbers you're getting are slow monetary numbers. They are starting to bite now. And so that pushes us off towards the long lag between changes in the money supply and changes in real economic activity. So we started thinking it would be on the short side because the money supply was contracting so fast, but we didn't fully appreciate that there was such a huge amount of excess liquidity build up behind it that actually hadn't all been drained off.
Absolutely.
So that's why I think it's going to be late this year that we see the recession coming. It's very hard to say when economic activity is actually going to change. The idea that somebody can pinpoint the quarter or the month, it's a fool's game. It's long and variable lags. The one thing we do know, it's baked in the cake.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know when with much precision.
Well, there's obviously part of what drives that lag factor is that the window of liquidity of the Federal Reserve for banks has exploded in 2023, which has had a much smaller impact on credit growth and on availability of credit in the financial system than what the monetary aggregates would indicate. Obviously, when banks that would have been having to address their liquidity issues are suddenly awash with liquidity, that makes a huge difference in access to credit. But if you look at the overall economic growth in 2023, the massive increase in government spending driven by debt and the availability of credit have basically just postponed that process that you were just mentioning. But it comes fundamentally from the fact that when you look at the Federal Reserve figures, M1, M2 are obviously declining, but then you look at the fourth column, which shows the window of liquidity to which banks go to try to offset their losses and their unrealized losses in their books. That one has exploded. No, so that is what is generating the mirage, in my view, of the soft landing. Is that what people say is, look, people are accessing credit. There is availability of credit cards. Consumption is relatively acceptable with a massive increase in credit card debt. Government consumption is going through the roof because deficit spending is unequal. So that, you said, it's baked in the cake. But I think that on top of that, there is a much worse problem, which is that the so-called soft landing is built on a very dangerous amount of liquidity supporting unproductive and very dangerously insolvent or close to insolvent debt. No?
Yes, I agree with that. It's a very clear analysis, and I agree that what it's done, you see, I went through earlier this repo thing with the money market funds and the fact that move into the money market funds and the money market funds buying treasuries from the non-bank public and the non-bank public's deposits going up and the money supply going up as a result, that mitigates quantitative tightening. And what you've said mitigates what would have been actually quite a credit squeeze, because the bank loans are actually on a year-over-year basis declining just a little bit. They're kind of static.
Yeah.
They're kind of static. But if there hadn't been what you just described, is this liquidity availability after the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, you would have had, I think, quite a sharp contraction in bank credit, bank loan. But it's been kind of steady due to what you said.
Yeah.
So so these things end up just kind of stalling the inevitable baked in the cake thing.
Absolutely, that is the critical thing. No, is that uh, uh, many times the neo-Keynesian narrative tells us that there's been a success on an inevitable event, basically just on borrowed time. But obviously, that generates another set of significant problems. No,
Right.
the first one being that just looking at GDP and the components of GDP is that the moment that any administration starts to address the absolutely out of control deficit that the United States is having right now, there is no way that the consumption and investment figure is going to offset the reduction year on year of government spending. Obviously, that may happen after an election year, but I come back to the point. It's basically excluding the accumulation of debt, the worst economic growth year since the 30s. So that's very, very dangerous because it reminds me very much of the same narrative of 2007. You may remember as well that the most repeated word in the economic circles in 2007 was soft landing. It was everywhere.
Right.
So the dangers is that obviously that does disguise the challenge. But I always talk about the private sector recession. I always talk about that and it's very evident in the euro area. Have more than a year and a half of massive contraction of the manufacturing sector and almost half a year of contraction of the services sector, and loans to business and families are basically, as you showed, flat. No. So it's basically helped by credit, but at the same time, non-performing loans are starting to creep up. The solvency of the borrowers is worse. All those things sort of tend to then accumulate to a point in which it bursts in some point. No?
That's right, and I think what both you and I are concluding here with our analysis is that given the conventional narrative, shall we call it the soft landing narrative, I think the public has been led into the kind of they're sleepwalking into a disaster. They don't really see this coming at all, and if you look in the United States, the recent consumer confidence index measures have improved a lot lately.
Yeah,
because the public's kind of buying into this. The public was very skeptical, very worried, but and the consumer confidence index, it's still below the trend rate. It's not great, but it's improved a lot the last couple months. And I think the public is sleepwalking into disaster. And you pick this up by looking at the stock market. The stock market is doing great.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But the problem of the stock market is that it's not discounting economic growth or the level of performance of earnings. What the stock market is basically discounting is a huge cut in interest rates and return to some level of quantitative easing, particularly after the decision of the Bank of Japan to do so, to basically forget.
Yeah, the market is priced in a soft landing completely.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. if you look at the estimates of consensus, you have almost a Goldilocks environment in which the United States is going to grow about 1.6 to 1.8%, with 2% inflation and with 3.3% unemployment.
So when you get polemicists like for example Professor Krugman in the New York Times, when the stock market is not consistent with where he wants things to be going, he says what? Well, how stupid the stock market. It's a bad indicator of everything. It's never been able to predict inflation, growth, or anything else. But now, if you read what he's saying, he says, "Oh, you know, the stock market's right in there with me. The stock market understands all this soft landing stuff. It's just like magic."
Absolutely. But the thing is, when we look at the stock market, and it's we have to remember that since 2011, not 2011, I would say 2009, 2010, the stock market reacts positively to negative economic data, because it is basically discounting that there will be some form of quantitative easing, some form of monetary injection, and reacts negatively to positive data. You just mentioned the consumer confidence figure. Remember that the day that was published, the stock market declined. Huh? Why?
Yeah.
Why? Because they were expecting that, oh my God, if it's a relatively positive piece of news, then there won't be rate cuts and there won't be monetary injections. Interestingly enough, when people started to look at the details of the consumer confidence and showed that it was basically just a bounce on a very negative trend, then the market got happy again about, you know, here comes the money, here comes the money present for Christmas. So we understand that the market is not discounting, and never did, by the way. 2007, the market was booming. But I think that you have said something that I think is very important, is that citizens, by accepting, the moment that citizens stop being prudent, which they have been between 2020 and 2023, I think. But the moment that citizens stop being prudent and say, oh, they said that there's not going to be a recession, everything is fine, let's take some credit. And they actually see that they have availability of credit even when their solvency ratios are getting worse. That's when the problem is really baked in, and when, as you said, people are sleepwalking into a disaster. No? I think that is very dangerous. Also because the figures of investment, the figures of real wage growth, and the figures of the of earnings of non-quoted small and medium enterprises are really, really poor.
Absolutely. And one thing, when you look at sentiment, you know, in the general public, the most dangerous thing is when people are surprised.
Yeah.
When you don't anticipate something and you're surprised, it really throws you off balance. It's just like a person, you know, if you're walking down the street and everything is fine, it's sunny, you're having a beautiful day, and all of a sudden a dog jumps out and barks at you. What happens? You're surprised, and maybe you'll trip and fall down.
Absolutely. And people don't realize yet, because they're being told all the time things like soft landing, etc. The risk builds slowly, but happens very fast.
Of course, the most dramatic historical example we have of this is the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Remember what the famous economist Irving Fisher said about the prior to the Great Depression. He was one of the most famous economists, a great economist, by the way.
Yeah.
And also a great businessman, and just a terrific personality in the economics profession. Well, he said that we are on something like a sustained plateau stability and high growth. Well,
Yeah.
that was just right prior to the crash. And so when the crash came, a lot of people were just shocked and couldn't believe it.
Exactly, because crisis never happen when people are expecting a crisis. Crisis happen when everybody expects things to go swimmingly. And
yeah,
the
what happens to continue with these analogies? They say soft landing. Well, if the pilot tells you there's going to be a soft landing, maybe you don't buckle your seatbelt.
exactly.
And when it's a hard landing, boom, you get thrown out of your seat.
And that's very dangerous because people are talking about the soft landing, thinking about the word soft. They're not thinking about what landing means. Okay, they're not thinking that landing in itself means that the Fed is expecting in some form some kind of recession, not maybe a technical one, maybe one that doesn't affect massively employment, but landing is a recession. The other problem,
Right.
the other problem is that if somebody has been completely unable to predict inflation, completely unable to predict any crisis, and completely unable to predict the trends of disinflation, I would be very, very, very careful to believe in their expectations of a soft landing.
Right.
Great. So we've discussed a little bit about the United States, but right now in Argentina, we are seeing something that you have followed for a very long time. You follow money growth and inflation in so many countries. It's always important to follow you because what you are checking in so many of emerging economies that blame inflation on everything else. In Argentina right now, we have a change of government. The government seems to be very adamant, the Milei government, on addressing the enormous hole in the central bank with the net negative reserves and the level of inflation and the importance of dollarization. A lot of people out there are saying dollarization is impossible. You cannot dollarize. What you have to do is a gradual improvement in the deficit and in the fiscal and commercial deficit. How do we explain to them that it makes absolutely no sense to talk about gradual measures with the situation of Argentina?
Okay, the first thing to put things into context, I measure inflation every day in Argentina. Today, the inflation rate's 244% per year. And the money supply is growing at around 100% year over year. So huge increase in the money supply and a lot of inflation. So inflation's the number one problem, and Milei has been elected and put into office in December of last year. And he had promised in his campaign platform that he would get rid of the peso and get rid of the BCRA, the central bank.
Yeah.
At the last minute, he put in a economics minister of economy, Luis Caputo.
Yeah.
And Caputo is essentially echoing the same line as the IMF and most economists. And that is that to dollarize, there are lots of preconditions that have to be met first. And once they're met, then you can dollarize. So he scared Milei, and Milei has shelved the dollarization temporarily. Now, their main argument is that you mentioned that the net foreign reserves at the central bank are negative, not positive. And so they say, we don't have enough foreign reserves to dollarize. But this is a very poor analysis that they've done. And this is not only the opponents of Milei, but Malay's own people have done it wrong.
Yeah.
And I say that as somebody who's actually dollarized two countries, Montenegro in 1999 and Ecuador in 2000, 2001. Now, what do you need to dollarize? You need enough gross foreign reserves, enough liquidity in paper dollars to take the paper pesos circulating out of circulation.
Yeah.
To exchange paper dollars for paper pesos. And they have enough to do that. The coverage is about, the ratio is 2.5 to 1.
Exactly.
The gross reserves are about 2.5 times the pace. The gross dollar reserves are about 2.5 times higher than the peso notes and coins outstanding. So it is feasible. Now, people could argue about that theory, but let's look at the practical side. Recently, Francisco Zales and I wrote an article about what happened in Ecuador, where we were both officially involved in the thing.
Yeah.
And the negative net reserves existed in Ecuador when we dollarized.
Absolutely.
It's gross that you need, not net. And so it is feasible. And I think, unfortunately for Malay, he's been given bad advice, because if he doesn't dollarize, he won't be able to kill inflation. And if he doesn't kill inflation, he's got a huge political problem, and his credibility is thrown into question. They say, oh, the guy isn't competent. He said he was going to dollarize. He didn't dollarize. He said he was going to get rid of inflation. Well, they haven't gotten rid of inflation. So we don't trust the guy. That's what's going to happen if he doesn't change gears and dollarize now.
Yeah.
He's got to do it now.
He needs to do it now, because all of the measures that he is implementing on the fiscal front, on the regulatory front, they mean absolutely nothing when you have the reality of a failed currency. They need to, it's like they don't want to understand, they don't want to address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that it does not matter if the central bank reaches net positive reserves. Citizens in Argentina, you know it, I know it, never save in pesos and will not save in pesos, because the confidence in the currency has been completely obliterated, and because they know that it does not matter what this administration does, because the next one will go back to increasing the money supply by 100, 150, 200% a year. Completely.
Oh, this is why when they did when Menem, I was at Menem's advisor from 1989 to 1999, and when we did the big currency reform in 1999, they did convertibility, but the problem was that system of convertibility was being managed by the central bank.
Absolutely.
And the central bank had a lot of discretionary monetary policy. That started on April 1st to 1991. And in October of 1991, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. I said, unless they get rid of the central bank, this thing will ultimately get into trouble and collapse. Well, it did. It took it 10 years, but it did actually get into trouble. Now, having the central bank there in Argentina, it's like putting a bottle of whiskey next to a recovering alcoholic. Even if you say you're not going to use it, you know the alcoholic will eventually reach for the bottle. And in Argentina, if you have any kind of monetary institution with any kind of discretionary monetary power, they will abuse that power, and they will get into a currency crisis of some sort.
Completely. I think this is absolutely critical for them to understand, is that unless they do it very, very quickly, And again, I come back to the point, the economy in so many aspects is already dollarized. There's no Argentine citizen that doesn't undertake a significant transaction in US dollars instead of pesos. I think that this is the most important message that has to be presented to them. And coming from you is absolutely relevant. Having the experience of that process with Ecuador and with Montenegro. Also, because in Argentina, they always say, oh, we dollarized before and it didn't work. No, because they didn't do what you just said. They kept the central bank with all of the tools to monetize all of the debt, all of the deficits that it wanted. And more importantly, it continued to issue remunerated debt of the central bank that ultimately means inflation in the future. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah, and if even if you look at the old convertibility system, that was not a dollarized system. It was just a pegged exchange rate, 1-to-1 peso to the US dollar. But the central bank had a tremendous amount of discretionary power. And after the tequila crisis in 1995, the discretionary activity at the central bank in Argentina was 6 times higher than it was in Chile, where Chile had a managed floating exchange rate. So you had wild discretion being used in Argentina from 1995 until ultimately the finish of the convertibility system at the end of 2000. So this idea that they had some kind of dollarized or pseudo dollarized system with convertibility, it's just not correct. This gets into a big problem. We've kind of alluded to this in our discussion, but you have to remember most economists don't look at any of the details. They actually don't know what they're talking about.
You bet.
And why? Why can I say I know what the central bank in Argentina was doing? Because I looked at the balance sheet. There's nothing, as Sir John R. Hicks, Nobel laureate, once said, there's nothing more important than a balance sheet. And most economists have never looked at a central bank balance sheet. They wouldn't even know how to read the central bank balance sheet. So that's why most of what they say about monetary economics or in general macroeconomics, it's just rubbish.
Absolutely, it is. And in the case of Argentina, unless they do something now, it's going to be much worse. Obviously, I think it's very important.
Yeah. Now one thing you said, Daniel, and I just checked. You said, well, no one wants to save in pesos in Argentina. Just look at this. Since Milei took office on December 10th, 2023, the peso has depreciated against the dollar by 21.1% since December 10th. So that's why of course no one wants to save in pesos.
Of course, because they're not stupid. Absolutely. Yeah.
And the Argentines are very clever. They've been experiencing this for a long time. This isn't the first time. Yeah. That's why the dollar notes outstanding, it's about $265 billion of US dollar notes under the mattress in safety deposit boxes in wallets in Argentina. Now, that is the second largest stock of dollars in the world, in any country. The first is the United States. That's the most. The second is Argentina. That's where all the dollars are.
No, absolutely. And it is absolutely clear. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's always a tremendous conversation, and I learned so much. And for our viewers, it's going to be an absolute pleasure. Everybody must follow you. And thank you very much for the generosity with your time. We have to repeat this more often, because it's always illuminating. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
this is great. Now, by the way, Daniel, they can follow me on Twitter at Steve underscore Hanke. That's the best way.
Absolutely. We will put all the details to follow Dr. Hanke in the description of this video, and obviously in LinkedIn and Twitter and all of the social media. Thank you.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Have a,
Have a great evening. Great to be with you, Daniel.
always a pleasure. Thank
Yeah,
you.
good. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.